welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Today is a little bit of a mixed bag. I have a feeling we'll be spending the most of the time on Nintendo. Every time, here's what I've noticed, and I have way more freedom to say things like this and get into things like this on the podcast. Every time I say something like, I'll only spend a couple minutes here, or let me just briefly tell you about... Anytime I say that, it usually winds up becoming a huge, long, several-minute-long explanation. So there's real human time, and then there's Geek Therapy Radio time, which is when I say, all right, let me just spend about 30 seconds on this. Really 30 seconds. It's multiplied by 9 or 10, and it's really like 3 minutes or 4 minutes at least. Anyways, so let's dive into Nintendo and new Switch announcements. Perhaps the biggest, there's two main announcements here. I mean, there's multiple announcements I'm going to get into, but the main announcements here are more Super Nintendo games coming to the Nintendo Switch, 20 of them to be perfectly accurate here. Overwatch coming to the Nintendo Switch, and a new Super Nintendo controller for $30. Coming to the Nintendo Switch, which makes sense because they're releasing more Super Nintendo games for the Nintendo Switch, so they already have their classic NES controller for the NES games on the Switch. Makes sense that they're releasing an SNES controller, but I'll get to that in a second because there's some fascinating things about this controller that I want to get into for what it omits and what it brings to mind, some similarities. But let me just first start by rattling off the 20 Super Nintendo games coming to the Nintendo Switch that will be available September 5th. So depending on whenever you're listening to this, they will most likely be available. Those games are Brawl Brothers, Demon's Crest, Joe and Mac 2, Lost in the Tropics, Kirby's Dream Land 3, awesome, Star Fox, awesome, Super EDF Earth Defense Force. A lot of these things, I understand that they're popular and they're well-loved games, but I don't have as much experience with them. For instance, I've never played Super EDF Earth Defense Force, which is what EDF stands for, Earth Defense Force. Why? It's redundant. Super Mario Kart, of course. Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. It's about time. I am really excited for that. Yoshi's Island is one of my favorite video games of all time. I still play it regularly in various different ports. Yoshi's Island, it heavily utilized the Super FX chip, and the game is still gorgeous today. It still holds up in 2019. If you put the original Yoshi's Island cartridge in a Super Nintendo, hooked up to an old CRT TV or Tube TV, whatever, however you play Yoshi's Island 2, the original version still holds up in 2019. It's still beautiful. It's still fun. The mechanics are great. It is just a great game in all aspects, holding it to the test of time in any era. It is a wonderful game. Next on the list is Super Puyo Puyo 2. Then we have Super Tennis, Breath of Fire, awesome, F-Zero, Kirby's Dream Course, Pilot Wings, and one of my all-time favorites, Stunt Race FX. I adored Stunt Race FX. I spent so much time playing it. The various vehicles in the game, they all had eyeballs, like googly eyes almost. They weren't googly eyes. They would focus and, it made the cars and the vehicles look like pets. It very much, what's the term for it? I'm blanking out on the term for it. It'll come to me in a second, probably. But it made the characters very relatable. You weren't just driving around in a monster truck. It made you feel like the monster truck really was like a pit bull. It had eyes and was kind of cute. It had a character. But Stunt Race FX was very fun. It was one of the first, well, not the first, but one of the first 3D fully rendered racing games for the Super Nintendo, if not the only fully 3D rendered, real-time rendered racing games on the Nintendo 3DS, on the Super Nintendo, sorry. Because I'm trying to think of other things. Yes, Star Fox obviously was what ushered in the Super FX chip. But Stunt Race FX, that was one of my favorites, doing big jumps with the different vehicles and everything. It was great. All right, so let's move down the list. Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Yeah. Super Mario World, of course. So you're going to release Super Mario World and Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island on the same release. That's wonderful. That's really great. Super Metroid. I mean, no duh. It's a no-brainer. Super Soccer. And, of course, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. To some, the best Zelda game to date. Do I agree or disagree with that? I don't know. Link's Awakening is great. And the remastered it's not remastered. The updated version of Link's Awakening is also coming out soon, and I'm super stoked for that. I'm just saying that my personal favorite Zelda game is Link's Awakening. That's just me. But yeah, so that's the list of 20 Super Nintendo games coming out to the Nintendo Switch as of September 5th. So no matter, actually, really, you're not going into the past to listen to this show. No matter when you're listening to the show, these games are going to be available on the Nintendo Switch for download. All right, moving on. The next, subject I hinted at here was the Super Nintendo controller, the classic NES controller coming out for the Switch. Now, here's my take on this. I don't see a home button or a star button anywhere on this controller. So I don't know if maybe they'll add one before it actually gets released. It's not released yet. I don't see an official release date on here. But it's coming soon, obviously, to correspond with the release of the Super Nintendo games. Yeah, I'm not seeing any release date anywhere on here. But that's not my main concern. It's that, how is it going to be a combination key press to go back to the home menu of the Switch? It does have not curiously, but it does have the shoulder buttons L and R, but it also has ZL and ZR. So for the GameCube, it's just increased compatibility with other Nintendo games that aren't necessarily just Super Nintendo games. So here's the curious thing, other than omitting the star button and the home button, this controller looks suspiciously close to the 8BitDo version. It's all one word, 8, the number 8, BITDO. I have one of the controllers. I love the controller. 8BitDo is probably the best third-party controller manufacturer around today. I'm sure that's arguable, but 8BitDo controllers are priced really well, and they're really, really good. They feel just as good, if not better, than the original hardware that they are copying. It's really good. But the 8BitDo controller, not only does it look almost exactly similar to Nintendo's Super NES controller, but it does have the home button and the star button. I was going to say it doesn't have ZL and ZR, but it does have extra shoulder buttons. It has R1 and R2 and L1 and L2. So, and it also has thumbsticks. This Super NES controller from Nintendo doesn't have analog thumbsticks that the 8BitDo controller does. At least one of the models does. So it's curious. I'm looking at the pairing button and the 4 LED indicators on the bottom of the controller. That looks... I wouldn't be surprised if Nintendo possibly worked with 8BitDo in developing this controller. It's a USB-C, recharging, which makes sense because that's what the Nintendo Switch relies on, is USB-C. So the other announcements, the other games coming out for the Nintendo Switch are Overwatch. That is perhaps the biggest announcement, and that actually leaked. There was an Amazon, I think it was a carrying case for the Nintendo Switch that had a bunch of Overwatch characters and logos and all sorts of stuff all over it. So that actually leaked. So we had a pretty good idea that Overwatch was coming to the Nintendo Switch. The other ones, like I mentioned, are Link's Awakening, Luigi's Mansion 3, and Pokemon, of course. Pokemon Sword and Shield. Sword and Shield. Sword and Shield. Sword and Shield. That's kind of hard to say, 3 times fast. Sword and Shield. Another honorable mention, there's a few here, but the most honorable mention, I think, to me at least personally, is Doom 64. It's the first port of Doom 64 to any system other than the original Nintendo 64. So that's really cool. And that's really all I have to say about Nintendo's recent Nintendo Direct announcement. And that happened yesterday, actually. I just rested on it a little bit. Moving on. Next topic of discussion. And this is just this has nothing to do with Nintendo. It's kind of out of left field here, but it's just something funny that I read. The movie Matilda came out in 1996, and really the reason I'm bringing it up is that my wife loves that movie. She grew up with that movie, and she likes that movie a lot. So some interesting kind of facts about it. Very brief. It's directed by Danny DeVito. Danny DeVito is in the movie, but he also directed the movie. And apparently, not only did Danny DeVito direct it and star in it, but he took care of Matilda, her real name is Mara Wilson, while her mother was in the hospital with cancer, and even got her mother, who's dying of cancer, an advanced copy of the movie so that she could watch it before she gave in to the illness. So Danny DeVito is like a saint. And the reason why that's funny to me is because people in modern history have no reference for Danny DeVito, not even as the Penguin in Batman. But most recently, he's been on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia for over 10 years. He wasn't in the first season. I think he came on in the second or third season of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, 2006 or 2007. So in modern memory, when you envision Danny DeVito, we're thinking of Frank Reynolds from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, who's just a degenerate, disgusting, filthy man. But in real life, he's awesome. He's an actor. That's just his job. So the only point I kind of want to make to this is that some people, not all people, maybe just a very few amount of people tend to base their emulation and their admiration of somebody based on characters that they play. So if an actor plays really nice characters, really genuine, cool characters, but in real life they're just absolute turds, it shocks some people. I never knew that actor was such a douche. Similarly, and Danny DeVito is a perfect case for this, he portrays just the worst of humanity, but in real life, they're wonderful people. And I guess it's my only commentary on this is about hero worship and kind of the way we pick and choose what we choose to like about an actor. That it's almost like we refuse to acknowledge sometimes that they're just real human beings with real, actual terrible problems. And that doesn't matter what characters they play on the screen. In real life, they're great. I know most people know this. I already know that. You're probably wondering, why are you even touching on this? Most people already know this. But you know what? I think it's worth mentioning because it doesn't have to be just with actors. It can be with politicians. It can be with anybody. And I'm not taking a stance politically on this or anything like that. It's just kind of, I think we need to be careful sometimes, even the best of us, with who we hero worship, and just take with a grain of salt that nobody's perfect. So to kind of wrap this up, the last thing I'll say, the last thing that was on my mind is harking back to, was it last podcast or I think it was the last podcast previous to this sequentially. I brought up the Jimmy John's boycott and outrage. And one thing I forgot to add to that is that a boycott you're not hurting the CEO of Jimmy John's. You're just hurting employees that are just trying to get by. I mean, these are minimum wage employees, and saying that you want to boycott all Jimmy John's is basically saying you want to hurt the employees. If you run down business at a Jimmy John's, people can get fired and lose their means of supporting themselves. So you're not sticking it to the CEO, you're sticking it to the person making $7 an hour behind the counter. So So just think about that. But on that point, the real reason I'm bringing this back up again is that photo of the elephant that he shot was from several years ago. This guy, he says he doesn't hunt big game like that anymore anyways. And of course, it was, like I said, a sanctioned hunt, in that wildlife preservationists, conservationists will bring up quickly that people just are ignorant. They don't understand the role that these type of hunts play in actually serving to help a species on the whole. That nobody's seeing this kind of clickbait in emotionally inducing pictures that run out and say boycott Jimmy John's. They're not thinking for even 1 second about the story behind it and the logic behind it. So that's what I wanted to get at to finish out this podcast. A basic rule of thumb that I apply to myself, and I think that can be applied to others who might struggle with this. And again, like I said, no one's perfect. I struggle with this just as much as the next person, but it's something that I always kind of keep in mind. You know, I say there's two huge influences in my life outside of my parents. The two biggest influences in my life are obviously God and Data from Star Trek, and to somewhat of a lesser extent, Spock. And what I mean by that is, whenever I get extremely emotional about something, so for instance, reading a news headline, it's just a headline. It's just a drive-by snippet of something designed to get you upset, designed to get me upset. The more it gets me upset, or the more emotion it evokes in me, the bigger the red flag that I need to stop and sit back, look a little bit more into what's behind the story. Basically, it's a red flag. If it's an emotional trigger, it's a red flag for me to be logical about it, to step back, bite my tongue, and reserve judgment or even saying anything about it if it invoked such an emotional reaction out of me. So, for instance, like I said, the Jimmy John's case, the emotional reaction is people seeing a man sitting in front of a dead elephant is boycott Jimmy John's. Or if you just take 5 minutes to research it, you'll see that this was actually part of a process that helps endangered species and helps ensure the proliferation of that species. It's all part of conservation. Hunting is a huge part of conservation. But nowhere in these stories or these tweets are you going to see something like explaining that initially. It's all meant to invoke emotion out of you. You remember, oh man, I don't want to get political, but do you remember...
do we do a 7?
Well, it was the Jussie Smollett case where he claimed that two men in MAGA hats, Make America Great Again hats, mugged him and beat him up for being a black homosexual. And how the country flipped out and made this judgment call immediately, because it's very emotional. Those were huge claims. But nobody at least waited. Not many people at least waited. Just bit their tongue and waited. You know, this all looks a little fishy. This is very high profile. Maybe I'll just wait a day or two and see how this shakes out before I make a comment on it. So many people jumped on this bandwagon of hatred towards Trump supporters and whoever, conservatives, whatever like that, before just waiting like, oh, the guy lied. Now, I'm not saying that hatred and racism doesn't exist, you know, on both sides of the aisle. Actually, if you think there's a monopoly on racism on one side of the aisle, I just watched a car wreck. I just saw somebody in the parking lot wreck their Scion. They just ran right into the side of the parking garage. That sucks. Now they're limping their car. They've done some damage. Maybe it's not that extensive a damage, but yeah, man, I'm distracted. I just saw the guy wreck his car. Anyways, I'm just saying there's no monopoly on racism on one side or the other. But back to the point. People jumped the gun and made assumptions without hearing all the details first, and it's just egg on the face. You get egg on the face. I have a feeling, And again, I'm free to get into this kind of stuff on the podcast because it's a free form to do it. I have this feeling that people don't really think for themselves when reacting. They wait for something to happen, and the only amount of time they give is the amount of time it takes to get on Twitter and see what everyone else thinks and then jump on that bandwagon. Does that make sense? That if something controversial happens, they don't have an opinion themselves. They'll go on social media and see what their friends and colleagues think about it, their snap decisions, and they, without doing a friggin' lick of research, they'll just jump on that bandwagon, and they'll just, despite their, better intentions, they'll continue to spread the ignorance or the hatred or get off on the hatred. A lot of us are guilty of this. So all I'm saying is the more emotional, the more high profile, the more outlandish the accusations and claims are, it's the bigger warning to take a step back and try to think about it logically, or at least get the details behind it first before making an assumption or a decision. And if you don't have all the details, then maybe we should just keep our mouths shut. It's better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you are a fool than to open your mouth and confirm it, or however the old saying goes. Now, I can only speak for me in my own personal life, but social media has made it very easy to sort out who I do and do not seek counsel with. I've got a lot of friends who I trust their opinions in certain matters over the others, but then I've got other friends and family who I would seek out with general counsel in an instant, because I know that they don't jump the gun and make controversial statements with absolutely zero knowledge or research onto what they are reacting to. Basically, what I'm saying is, on social media, I see people react immediately to and make snap judgments. I don't go to those people when I need help with something, because I know that they're not going to think thoughtfully about my problem to help me. They're only going to react emotionally to whatever I told them. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Versus people that I know who big things happen in the media, big news happens in the thing, there's an outrage and a trending hashtag of the day, and they keep their mouths shut. Those are the people I seek out for wisdom and counsel with anything in life. Even if they haven't walked a mile in my shoe, even if they don't know exactly what I'm going through, those are the people I seek out for their wisdom. That leads me to something else that just popped in my nerd brain, and that's what we get into here on Geek Therapy Radio. I'm free to wander, especially on these podcasts. Related but unrelated. Experience isn't the only factor in who I do and do not seek to learn from. And I'll use an awesome analogy for that. I've been playing guitar since I was 12 or 13 years old, been learning guitar off and on since then. And my brother, my oldest brother, we were playing around one day and he was showing me Eruption. He knew how to play Eruption. And one of the things he mentioned, and it kind of broke my heart when he said it, he's like, "Oh, I don't play much guitar anymore. You just got so much better than me. I just kind of put it down." And that broke my heart. I was like, it doesn't matter. And some people that I jam with, they'll say the kind of the same sentiment. Not that I'm better than them or whatever, but the sentiment that, they don't feel like they're good enough to jam with anybody else. Or they might feel that I'm better than them at the guitar in whatever instance, that I have 10 years of experience over them or whatever, and they've just started learning. I don't care if someone's only been to one guitar lesson. I still want to play with them, because here's the thing. Everybody learns it differently, and you can still learn from beginners. I am not an expert at guitar. I am not an expert at the guitar. But I have been playing for a long time, and I even more so value learning from a beginner than from an expert. because everybody goes about learning it a different way, and there's new things to pick up on from a beginner who by default is stepping into the process, the learning process, from a different angle, an angle that I didn't come at it from. By the time you get too advanced, in playing an instrument, you settled into quote unquote the way or whatever. You settled into the groove of how you exactly should be learning. But when you're a beginner, you don't know everything yet. And that's a beautiful thing, because you can see things from so many different angles and viewpoints that you perceive things at the beginning that I never picked up on in my course. Does that kind of make sense? So I guess all I'm trying to say here is let's try to be thoughtful. And again, I keep reiterating, I am just as guilty of this. I don't want it to ever sound on this show that I'm browbeating or being self-righteous or anything like that, because I am just as horrible as anybody else. No one is better than anyone else, really, on the baseline. There's good people, but, good people still do bad things. There are people that are actually terrible. Hitler is actually terrible. I think we can all agree on that. His body of work he's a terrible man. But the reason I vent these things into the microphone is it's a reminder to me as well. Because we all do get emotional. We all do think that we have it figured out sometimes. Oh, I don't need to seek counsel with this person. I'm not going to ask the beginner for advice or try to learn anything from them because I'm more advanced than that person. Maybe it's a computer programmer and they're just learning how to write code. Maybe an advanced programmer doesn't think they can glean anything from a beginning coder. But I promise you can. Can't hurt to talk to them. You might pick up on something. I didn't remember PEMDAS in math for years until someone just learning it again, or I learned it again in a beginner's math textbook. I forgot about PEMDAS. I'm an idiot. That's stupid. I was 31 years old when I remembered PEMDAS and or learned about it for the first time. How do you go through your whole life? That's such a basic thing, but I miss that basic thing. And sometimes we can miss basic things. So it's, it's okay that we seek counsel from beginners and seek wisdom from people who don't open their mouth at the drop of a hat. Hope this made sense. Hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. It's kind of a long one, 28 minutes coming up on here. We are all geeks about something. Embrace your inner geek. Please know that you are worthy of loving and being loved. You are worthy of love. You really are. I promise you are. If you have anything you want to write to me about, it's geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. Those of you who have been writing to me, you know that I respond to most of it. I definitely read all of it. That's always it's easy to read all of it. And I respond to at least most of it, for sure. So geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. One of the things I call for on the show is accountability. If I said something that's wrong, ever, please email me, reach out so that I can correct it and get it right, because it's all about sharing knowledge with each other. So geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. There's also the Facebook page, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Geek Therapy Radio on Instagram, Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube. There's all sorts of ways to get in touch with me, but email is the most direct, because while I'm sitting here at work, it pops up and I see it. Oh, so-and-so emailed me, and I'll go and read it and often respond to it. geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. All right, so thank you very much for listening. Take care. I will see you guys in the next one. Be good.